purchased a brand new Makita chop saw, compound miter saw. About a month ago, we purchased another one to replace the one that was 2 months old, or actually it was 1 month old. And the reason that they purchased another one, because a member had an incident in the shop that damaged the saw to the extent that it would have taken about at least 3 or 4 months to get the part. We needed the whole base that was damaged, get the part, and we'd have been without a saw for that period of time. So the decision was made, let's just buy another saw. And that's what this is. This saw is brand new. This has only been in service about 2 or 3 weeks. I want to go through the incident that the member had so that you know that is not something to do. The setup that you see here is the setup that he had. He was cutting a 45-degree miter on a piece of wood this size. This is the actual piece. Behind I don't have this piece, but behind his piece was a stop block that was also cut at a 45-degree miter. He clamped it like this with one clamp so that the clamp was holding the stop block in place, and it was also holding his workpiece in place. That was all that was holding this in place. Then he came over here to make his cut. Now, he did not hold it with his hand because he felt that the clamp was going to hold the piece in place. And as he started going through a pretty heavy piece, the piece got out of control and lifted up. You see there's nothing holding it. The piece came up in here and crashed against the saw, breaking parts in here, breaking another clamp off that wasn't even involved in this setup, and damaging the saw where it broke out part of the forging. This is something you don't want to do. You always want to just put your workpiece in the saw where you can hang on to it with your hand if you can, especially if it's a heavy piece, in addition to the clamp. Not only that, but when you use the clamp, you want to use your clamp as close to the saw blade as you can get. You see how far away this is from the saw blade? That's a bad setup. You want your clamp as close to the saw as you can possibly get it. Okay? Now you don't have to clamp it down to where you're squeezing the juice out of the wood. You have to clamp it down just firmly. But then you want to additionally hold it with your hand if you can, if your workpiece is big enough, so that you can run the saw through and you have control of your workpiece at all times. Okay? Fortunately, no one was hurt. But the force that that piece flew up and did the damage to that saw was pretty severe. We have to be very, very cautious about this in the shop. Not only did we ruin a brand new compound saw, someone could have been injured. Okay? I'm going to go take some questions if you have any about this setup. But after that, I want to go through this saw, because this saw is different in enough ways from the DeWalt saw that a lot of people get confused about it. Are there any questions about the setup?
Well, I noticed when you first started, you were on the other side.
This is where he should have been, and this is what he should have clamped it there. He should have had another clamp back here to hold his stop block. Okay?
But would it matter if he was on the other side where he could hold it with his hand?
Over here?
Uh-huh.
No, because see, it makes it too awkward for him to push the saw. You have to address the saw. Okay? Like this, and I would say this is a safer way. Actually, a safer way to do that, because okay?
Then he's using his right hand.
Yeah.
Then you're using your right hand, which, hey, let's face it, most of these saws are built for right-handed people.
have a left-handed.
They do? We don't have many left-handed tools. But this is the way he should have had it set up. He could have put a clamp in here and held it with his left hand. Then he had more control with his right hand, because I think what happened, he didn't have the strength maybe or the control of his left hand trying to push it through that heavy piece. But this is the setup he should have used with the clamp over here. Okay. Any questions before I go on?
Now, if the clamp that belonged to that machine was on the left side where it belongs, he could have clamped it on that side. Right now you can't clamp it because you don't have the clamp.
But the clamp, there was a clamp on that
On
side.
the other side.
Yes. There was a clamp over here.
There's supposed to be 2 clamps, one on each side.
There was.
There was a clamp over here. Well, you see, he could have clamped it right there. See how close we are to the blade? Can you get that here? See how close we are to the blade? That's where you want to clamp, not back here. Now, we got the clamp holding the workpiece. He can also put his hand on there and steady the workpiece. And then he's using his right hand with where he has more control and pushing the saw through the workpiece.
But getting back to the original setup, what would have been the proper clamp, additional proper clamp to use? If he had put another clamp on that piece, it would have been okay.
What he should have done was clamped his stop block with another clamp. Well, depends on the size of his stop block. He could have clamped it right here, because there's no force against the stop block. That's just his measuring block.
Right.
Okay? Then he could have moved this clamp further in to closer to the blade, and it would have given him more support, and he could have held it with his hand. If he can't get to it and use it properly with his hand, then he needs to maybe look for a different setup, like this.
I think he's talking about the second clamp for the measuring block.
For the measuring block,
You can use this.
you can use a Woodworkers clamp, you can use a C clamp, anything that will hold that stop block, because there's no force against the stop block. He's just using it for length measurement. Okay? Any other questions? One thing that you noticed right away about this saw is that this saw is a double slider. Has 2 slides in it. Okay? He has a slide at the top and a slide at the bottom. For over 90% of your cuts, you don't need the bottom slide at all. The only time you need the bottom slide is if you're cutting something about 15 inches wide. The rest of the time, what you should do is lock it in the back position with this little lever right here. You pull that lever toward you, and that locks the bottom slide where it doesn't move. The only slide you want to use is the top slide. That's one adjustment. The other adjustment that's different on this saw from the DeWalt is how you free up the miter arm. On this saw, you turn it counterclockwise and it locks the miter arm in place, no matter where you're at. If you want to release the miter arm, you push in, turn it clockwise, press the button, because the button gets you out of the factory set notch. Push the button and then you can go wherever you want. That's how you adjust the miter arm. Totally different from the DeWalt saw. Okay? The other thing is, this saw has a, can't see it there, has a laser for you to use. That's different. The DeWalts did not have the laser. Now, we all know that lasers are only good if they're in line with the blade. If they're not, it's just a pretty light. Okay? So let's hope they're in line with the blade. Now, to adjust the bevel of the blade, this is where it gets a little tricky. The first thing you always want to know about cutting a bevel, you have to move the top fence out of the way. Otherwise you're going to cut right down to it, or the saw is going to bind up against it. So you just release the screw a little bit and these will slide right out of the way. Okay? You always want to remember to do that. The reason I say that is because on the DeWalt saw though, we already cut off the corner 2 or 3 times. Okay? Now, I want to show you this little, when we get into bevels, see this little adjustment right here. See this little lever?
Can't see it. You have to point, can you point from the other side?
See this little lever right here? That lever is for the 22.5 and the 33.9 degree bevel. Those are presets. 22.5 is a preset because it's half of 45. 33.9 is a preset especially for crown molding. That's all it's for. When you get into adjusting the bevel, the saw, you have to loosen. Can you see this in the back here? You just loosen this arm a little bit with this. It's got a big lever back here. Did you show that lever?
Yeah.
Now, when you loosen that lever, the saw will go to the left, but it will not go to the right because you're up against a 90-degree stop. So you don't want to try to force it to the right. What you have to do is, I think you're going to have to come around here because I want to show the button. What you're going to have to do, and it makes it a little easier for you actually, now if you release that back slide and let the saw come forward and unlock it, it makes it a little easier for you to get to. This button right here releases the saw so you can tilt it to the right. But it's hard to push. You can't push it. And the reason for that is you have to bring it about 10 degrees to the left first, and then it'll push in real easy. Okay, now I'm up against the fence. Then it'll push real easy, but if you try to push it without first bringing it back about 10 degrees, you're going to have a hard time. You're going to say, this button's not right. But it is right. You just have to bring it back toward you. Now you take it down to wherever you want, okay? And if you're in between, the only factory stops on the bevel is 22.5, 45, and 33.9. Other than that, you got to pick where you want it to go, and then adjust or use a angle cube or something to set your bevel that you want. Okay? Then you tighten it up in the back with this arm, and it's locked in place. Okay? Any questions so far? Everybody understand that?
Everybody's going to have to try it.
Yes.
That'd be great.
You should try it. Come in and practice. Try to practice. When you want to come back to the other position, then you loosen it, come back to where you want to go. Now, if you want the factory setting on 22.5, you flip this little lever here, okay? And then as soon as you get down to 22.5, it'll lock into place. But to get out of the 22.5, you're not going to get out of it until you push this button again to release it, and now you can get out of the 22.5 bevel. Okay. But this is the trickiest thing of trying to get the saw to go to the right. You got to bring it to the left first, about 10 degrees, then the button will push real easy, and you can tilt it to the right wherever you want to go. If you're cutting small pieces, we have the miter saw bridge. Don't forget to use the miter saw bridge. You set it on your piece, and you bring the clamp around and clamp it down if you have a short piece where you don't want to get that close to the blade. Okay? Any questions? The bridge, let's say you have a real short piece and you don't want to get your hand in there, you put the bridge across it with another piece the same thickness over here, and you put the clamp here to hold it down. Both the saws have bridges over there, so you want to use the bridges. Have a little sandpaper on the back to help hold it, but use the bridge. Okay? Did I miss anything?
So, So, the only other thing is, if people want to use it just as a chop saw.
Oh, good point. Thank you, Ray.
Let
me bring that back.
Both slides in. There's a slot for the top saw.
You know, it's a lot easier to it's a lot easier if you're cutting some short pieces. The only time you have to use the slide motion is if you're cutting something that's wider than 4 inches. If you're cutting something 4 inches or less, it's a lot easier to just use it as a chop saw. Okay, like that. Because sometimes the slide kind of confuses you a little bit. You don't know how far to bring it out in that. Just use it as a chop saw. And to do that, there's a little lever over here to lock the top slide. You just snug it up right there. And now it's just a chop saw. Okay? Okay. Any questions? I want to cover one more thing before we leave.
How about ripping?
About what?
Ripping.
Dripping.
Ripping.
Oh, ripping. Yeah, if you're going to rip on the chop saw, you're going to be asked to leave the shop. We redid the jig on the small segment saw, okay? The saw has been redone to where this is the saw you should be using if you have small pieces. Anything that will fit in this tray, which is 3 inches. If you have 3 inches or less, this is the saw you want to use. The saw blade here is a fine saw blade. It's not aggressive at all like the other chop saws. And this is the saw you want to be using. Not only that, if you're doing picture frames, this is the saw you want to use. We've offset the jig so that you can make up to a 26-inch picture frame and still use a stop block so that all your pieces are the same length. So try to use this saw whenever you can when you have small pieces or narrow strips or anything like that. Okay. Any questions on this saw? Yes.
Now, on that saw, if you're cutting very small segments, all right, the stop block comes up. But I found that if you create a stop block of the same angle that you're cutting and leave that in there, so the new piece you're cutting comes into it, it doesn't pop out, it doesn't jump.
Well, I'm not sure it won't jump, but what we've done here is we've made our stop guide out of 1/4-inch material. That way you don't have so much material that's going to bind the piece in here between your blade and the stop block, okay? What you're saying is fine, but you got to make one long enough so you can clamp it somewhere. Right. The key thing here when using this saw or any saw, you got to hold this down until the blade stops and then bring it up. If you bring it up with the blade still winding down, it's going to throw your piece. So make sure you hold it down to, the other thing on this saw before, we could only cut a miter to the left. We've changed that. Now we can cut a miter both ways. We can go to the right or we can go to the left. So we're now taking full use of the saw, and I'd like to see everybody start to use it a little more. I see people cutting small strips and small pieces on these big aggressive chop saws, and they're just too aggressive for that. Okay? Any questions? You have anything?
Sounds good.
Thank you for your attention. That's it.